Milk selection was an example of successful community building. But the question remains, why did the gay community come together at this moment in U.S. history? The answer, I think, lies at least part with definitions of manhood and American notions of masculinity. Masculinity, like any socially defined reality, has evolved over time. Historian Anthony Rotundo states, and I quote, "Starting with a handful of biological differences, people in all places and in all times have invented elaborate stories about what it means to be male and female. Sex refers to the division of animal forms into male and female according to basic differences of anatomy. Gender refers to the meanings that people attach to a person's sex. Sex is a matter of biology, and gender is a matter of culture." These definitions evolved in phases in U.S. history, and among the first phase is what we can call the communal man. In the early settlements of North America, life was precarious in the New World. Take a look at this map of Boston in the 1700s. Look at how closely people were connected to each other in small, tightly knit communities. Being a man was closely connected to your position in the community. This meant much more than economic success. A man's status was inherited. His place at the head of the household guaranteed his place in society. This world slowly, but then with increasing speed, gave way to new circumstances that produced a new definition of manhood, that of the self-made man. Starting in the first quarter of the 19th century, there came about huge changes in American life. This was the great ventilating of America. Republican government, the rapid growth of a market economy, the explosion of the population, westward expansion, and the growth of the middle class. At the root of all these changes was one fundamental reality: the free play of individual interests. Now, manhood was changed. It's not associated with just the position in the community as before, but with a man's own individual achievements. Now a man's work role, his accomplishments in agriculture, in business, on the frontier, not his status at the head of a household, defined his identity. Look at these images. The frontiersmen, men like Daniel Boone and John Wesley Powell and Wild Hank Sharp, embodied this ideal. Ambition, rivalry, aggression redefined manhood now. Unlike 100 years before, when men repressed their passions and energies, now they gave them full vent. The central virtue in this new, expanding republic was independence and autonomy. The idea of the self-made man, the aggressive man who controlled his own destiny, was established and persisted after the Civil War, but again the environment was changing. And now in the latter half of the 19th century, we once again see great changes. Industrialization, on a great scale, threatened men's independence as they entered factory work by the millions. Immigration threatened men's sense of masculinity as they found themselves competing with millions of immigrants that drove their wages down. Look at these images and imagine how men might be threatened by such an onslaught. There is no space anymore for those earlier expressions of manhood. Urbanization, in those images, brought men together in crowded cities where they worked in factories and saw immigrants from abroad and blacks from the South and women making inroads into the public sphere, threatening them. From a population of 4 million in 1790 to 31 million in 1860 to 71 million in 1900, you can see that these men are being crowded out. All these developments, urbanization, industrialization, immigration, essentially threatened the central idea of the self-made man, the independent one who was in control of his destiny. So the powerful idea, the self-made man, was no longer working. It was no longer valid. So, if there was no more frontier to conquer, if a white man worked in a factory, if he could not control his income, if he was jostled about by new people seeking their place in his world, what was left of the essence of his masculine identity? I would suggest that what was left was sexuality as the central element in American manhood. One observer stated, men increasingly conceived of their sexuality, their heterosexuality, or exclusive desire for women, as one of the hallmarks of a real man. It was as if they had decided that no matter how much their gender comportment might be challenged, they were normal men because they were heterosexual. If all men had left was their sexuality, they defended it with great vigor, starting in the late 19th century. Here began the campaigns of exclusion, the gay bashing. Health reformer Bernard McFadden, in 1904, denounced what he called the perfumed, mincing, lisping youths that at night swarm on Broadway or haunt the parks, ogling every man that passes, and, it is pleasant to relate, occasionally getting a sound thrashing or an emphatic kicking. It was at this time that a new vocabulary was invented for gay men: degenerate, pervert, fairy. These were the names that men invented to define homosexuals, and the names made clear what constituted normal heterosexual behavior. By defining others, gay men, as abnormal, men defined their own masculinity in terms of their own normal sexual behavior. Most of these new names, it's interesting to point out, came from scholars and physicians. Now the association between masculinity and heterosexuality was firmly planted in the public's mind. So let's come back to where we started. How are these issues related to the formation of the gay communities of the 1980s? There was no room for gay men in this new version of masculinity. This does much to explain why a much more cohesive, aggressive gay culture emerged after 1969. Gays had been forced underground, and pressure and frustration built throughout the 20th century, waiting for a moment of release. The gay community was ready to express its frustration at being left out of the mainstream, of being marginalized, of being a victim. Take a look at these two video clips. The first shows San Francisco as depicted by the 1960s media. The second is a clip from a Mike Wallace hour-long CBS special report, The Homosexuals, aired nationwide, wherein he stated, "Americans consider homosexuality more harmful to society than adultery, abortion, or prostitution. Most Americans are repelled by the mere notion of homosexuality." The third clip is a 1950s warning to young boys, representing gay men as predatory and gay men shown as sick.